The Secret Rose. By William Butler Yeats. Dedication. As for living, our servants will do that for us. Villiers de L'Isle Adam. Helen, when she looked in her mirror, seeing the withered wrinkles made in her face by old age, wept, and wondered why she had twice been carried away. Leonardo da Vinci. My dear A.E., I dedicate this book to you because, whether you think it well or ill written, you will sympathize with the sorrows and the ecstasies of its personages, perhaps even more than I do myself. Although I wrote these stories at different times and in different manners, and without any definite plan, they have but one subject, the war of spiritual with natural order. And how can I dedicate such a book to anyone but to you, the one poet of modern Ireland who has molded a spiritual ecstasy into verse? My friends in Ireland sometimes ask me when I am going to write a really national poem or romance, and by a national poem or romance I understand them to mean a poem or romance founded upon some famous moment of Irish history, and built up out of the thoughts and feelings which move the greater number of patriotic Irishmen. I on the other hand believe that poetry and romance cannot be made by the most conscientious study of famous moments and of the thoughts and feelings of others, but only by looking into that little, infinite, faltering, eternal flame that we call ourselves. If a writer wishes to interest a certain people among whom he has grown up, or fancies he has a duty towards them, he may choose for the symbols of his art their legends, their history, their beliefs, their opinions. Because he has a right to choose among things less than himself, but he cannot choose among the substances of art. So far, however, as this book is visionary, it is Irish for Ireland, which is still predominantly Celtic, has preserved with some less excellent things a gift of vision, which has died out among more hurried and more successful nations. No shining candelabra have prevented us from looking into the darkness, and when one looks into the darkness there is always something there. W. B. Yeats. How do you find this book? Any thoughts about the book or the author? Any suggestion for improvement? Please take a moment to share your thoughts in a comment. If you like it, share it with your friends who might enjoy it as well. Subscribe to keep in touch. Visit CompleteAudiobooks.com for more quality content. To the Secret Rose. Far off, most secret, and inviolate rose, enfold me in my hour of hours, where those who sought thee at the holy sepulchre, or in the wine vat, dwell beyond the stir and tumult of defeated dreams, and deep among pale eyelids heavy with the sleep men have named beauty, your great leaves enfold the ancient beards, the helms of ruby and gold, of the crowned magi, and the king whose eyes saw the pierced hands and root of elder rise in druid vapor and make the torches dim, till vain frenzy awoke and he died. And him who met fanned walking among flaming dew, by a grey shore where the wind never blew, and lost the world and a mere for a kiss, and him who drove the gods out of their liss, until 100 morns had flowered red, feasted, and wept the barrows of his dead, and the proud dreaming king who flung the crown and sorrow away, and calling bard and clown, dwelt among wine-stained wanderers in deep woods, and him who sold tillage and house and goods, and sought through lands and islands numberless years, until he found with laughter and with tears a woman of so shining loveliness, that men threshed corn at midnight by a tress, a little stolen tress. I too await the hour of thy great wind of love and hate. When shall the stars be blown about the sky, like the sparks blown out of a smithy, and die? Surely thine hour has come, thy great wind blows. Far off, most secret, and inviolate rose. The Crucifixion of the Outcast. A man, with thin brown hair and a pale face, half ran, half walked, along the road that wound from the south to the town of Sligo. Many called him Cumhal, the son of Cormac, and many called him the swift, wild horse, and he was a gleeman, and he wore a short party-coloured doublet, and had pointed shoes, and a bulging wallet. Also he was of the blood of the Ernans, and his birthplace was the field of gold, but his eating and sleeping places were the 4 provinces of Erie, and his abiding place was not upon the ridge of the earth. His eyes strayed from the abbey tower of the White Friars and the town battlements to a row of crosses which stood out against the sky upon a hill a little to the eastward of the town, and he clenched his fist, and shook it at the crosses. He knew they were not empty, for the birds were fluttering about them, and he thought how, as like as not, just such another vagabond as himself was hanged on one of them. And he muttered, if it were hanging or bowstringing, or stoning or beheading, it would be bad enough. But to have the birds pecking your eyes and the wolves eating your feet. I would that the red wind of the Druids had withered in his cradle the soldier of Dathy, who brought the tree of death out of barbarous lands, or that the lightning, when it smote Dathy at the foot of the mountain, had smitten him also. Or that his grave had been dug by the green-haired and green-toothed Merrows deep at the roots of the deep sea. While he spoke, he shivered from head to foot, and the sweat came out upon his face, and he knew not why, for he had looked upon many crosses. He passed over 2 hills and under the battlement gate, and then round by a left-hand way to the door of the abbey. It was studded with great nails, and when he knocked at it, he roused the lay brother who was the porter, and of him he asked a place in the guest-house. Then the lay brother took a glowing turf on a shovel, and led the way to a big and naked outhouse strewn with very dirty rushes. And lighted a rush candle fixed between 2 of the stones of the wall, and set the glowing turf upon the hearth and gave him 2 unlighted sods and a wisp of straw, and showed him a blanket hanging from a nail. And a shelf with a loaf of bread and a jug of water, and a tub in a far corner. Then the lay brother left him and went back to his place by the door. And Cumhal the son of Cormac began to blow upon the glowing turf that he might light the 2 sods and the wisp of straw. But the sods and the straw would not light, for they were damp. So he took off his pointed shoes, and drew the tub out of the corner with the thought of washing the dust of the highway from his feet. But the water was so dirty that he could not see the bottom. He was very hungry, for he had not eaten all that day. So he did not waste much anger upon the tub, but took up the black loaf, and bit into it, and then spat out the bite, for the bread was hard and mouldy. Still he did not give way to his anger, for he had not drunken these many hours. Having a hope of heath beer or wine at his day's end, he had left the brooks untasted, to make his supper the more delightful. Now he put the jug to his lips, but he flung it from him straightway, for the water was bitter and ill-smelling. Then he gave the jug a kick, so that it broke against the opposite wall, and he took down the blanket to wrap it about him for the night. But no sooner did he touch it than it was alive with skipping fleas. At this, beside himself with anger, he rushed to the door of the guest-house, but the lay brother, being well accustomed to such outcries, had locked it on the outside. So he emptied the tub and began to beat the door with it, till the lay brother came to the door and asked what ailed him, and why he woke him out of sleep. "What ails me?" shouted Cumhal, "are not the sods as wet as the sands of the 3 Rosses? And are not the fleas in the blanket as many as the waves of the sea and as lively? And is not the bread as hard as the heart of a lay brother who has forgotten God? And is not the water in the jug as bitter and as ill-smelling as his soul? And is not the foot-water the color that shall be upon him when he has been charred in the undying fires?" The lay brother saw that the lock was fast, and went back to his niche, for he was too sleepy to talk with comfort. And Cumhal went on beating at the door, and presently he heard the lay brother's foot once more, and cried out at him, "O cowardly and tyrannous race of friars, persecutors of the bard and the gleeman, haters of life and joy! O race that does not draw the sword and tell the truth! O race that melts the bones of the people with cowardice and with deceit!" "Gleeman," said the lay brother, "I also make rhymes. I make many while I sit in my niche by the door, and I sorrow to hear the bards railing upon the friars. Brother, I would sleep, and therefore I make known to you that it is the head of the monastery, our gracious abbot, who orders all things concerning the lodging of travelers." "You may sleep," said Cumhal, "I will sing a bard's curse on the abbot." And he set the tub upside down under the window, and stood upon it, and began to sing in a very loud voice. The singing awoke the abbot, so that he sat up in bed and blew a silver whistle until the lay brother came to him. "I cannot get a wink of sleep with that noise," said the abbot. "What is happening?" "It is a gleeman," said the lay brother, "who complains of the sods, of the bread, of the water in the jug, of the foot water, and of the blanket. And now he is singing a bard's curse upon you, O brother abbot, and upon your father and your mother, and your grandfather and your grandmother, and upon all your relations." "Is he cursing in rhyme?" "He is cursing in rhyme, and with 2 assonances in every line of his curse." The abbot pulled his nightcap off and crumpled it in his hands, and the circular brown patch of hair in the middle of his bald head looked like an island in the midst of a pond. For in Connaught they had not yet abandoned the ancient tonsure for the style then coming into use. "If we do not somewhat," he said, "he will teach his curses to the children in the street, and the girls spinning at the doors, and to the robbers upon Ben Bulben." "Shall I go, then," said the other, "and give him dry sods, a fresh loaf, clean water in a jug, clean foot water, and a new blanket, and make him swear by the blessed Saint Benignus, and by the sun and moon, that no bond be lacking not to tell his rhymes to the children in the street, and the girls spinning at the doors, and the robbers upon Ben Bulben?" "Neither our blessed patron nor the sun and moon would avail at all," said the abbot. "For tomorrow or the next day the mood to curse would come upon him, or a pride in those rhymes would move him, and he would teach his lines to the children, and the girls, and the robbers. Or else he would tell another of his craft how he fared in the guest-house, and he in his turn would begin to curse, and my name would wither. For learn there is no steadfastness of purpose upon the roads, but only under roofs and between 4 walls. Therefore I bid you go and awaken brother Kevin, brother Dove, brother Little Wolf, brother Bald Patrick, brother Bald Brandon, brother James and brother Peter. And they shall take the man, and bind him with ropes, and dip him in the river that he shall cease to sing. And in the morning, lest this but make him curse the louder, we will crucify him." "The crosses are all full," said the lay brother. "Then we must make another cross. If we do not make an end of him another will, for who can eat and sleep in peace while men like him are going about the world? Ill should we stand before blessed Saint Benignus, and sour would be his face when he comes to judge us at the last day, were we to spare an enemy of his when we had him under our thumb. Brother, the bards and the glee-men are an evil race, ever cursing and ever stirring up the people, and immoral and immoderate in all things, and heathen in their hearts, always longing after the son of Lyre, and Angus, and Bridget, and the Dagda, and Dana the mother, and all the false gods of the old days. Always making poems in praise of those kings and queens of the demons, Finveraf, whose home is under Cruachma, and Red Aegon of Knocknasidhe, and Clina of the Wave, and Aebhel of the Grey Rock, and him they call Dawn of the Vats of the Sea. And railing against God and Christ and the blessed saints. While he was speaking he crossed himself, and when he had finished he drew the nightcap over his ears, to shut out the noise, and closed his eyes, and composed himself to sleep. The lay brother found brother Kevin, brother Dove, brother Little Wolf, brother Bald Patrick, brother Bald Brandon, brother James and brother Peter sitting up in bed, and he made them get up. Then they bound Cumhal, and they dragged him to the river, and they dipped him in it at the place which was afterwards called Buckley's Ford. "Gleeman," said the lay brother, as they led him back to the guest-house, "why do you ever use the wit which God has given you to make blasphemous and immoral tales and verses? For such is the way of your craft. I have, indeed, many such tales and verses well nigh by rote, and so I know that I speak true. And why do you praise with rhyme those demons, Finveraf, Red Aegon, Clina, Aebhel and Dawn? I, too, am a man of great wit and learning, but I ever glorify our gracious abbot, and Benignus our patron, and the princes of the province. My soul is decent and orderly, but yours is like the wind among the Sally Gardens. I said what I could for you, being also a man of many thoughts, but who could help such a one as you?" "Friend," answered the gleeman, "my soul is indeed like the wind, and it blows me to and fro, and up and down, and puts many things into my mind and out of my mind, and therefore am I called the swift, wild horse." And he spoke no more that night, for his teeth were chattering with the cold. The abbot and the friars came to him in the morning, and bade him get ready to be crucified, and led him out of the guest-house. And while he still stood upon the step, a flock of great grass barnacles passed high above him with clanking cries. He lifted his arms to them and said, O great grass barnacles, tarry a little, and mayhap my soul will travel with you to the waste places of the shore and to the ungovernable sea. At the gate a crowd of beggars gathered about them, being come there to beg from any traveller or pilgrim who might have spent the night in the guest-house. The abbot and the friars led the gleeman to a place in the woods at some distance, where many straight young trees were growing, and they made him cut one down and fashion it to the right length, while the beggars stood round them in a ring, talking and gesticulating. The abbot then bade him cut off another and shorter piece of wood, and nail it upon the first. So there was his cross for him, and they put it upon his shoulder, for his crucifixion was to be on the top of the hill where the others were. A half-mile on the way he asked them to stop and see him juggle for them, for he knew, he said, all the tricks of Angus the subtle-hearted. The old friars were for pressing on, but the young friars would see him, so he did many wonders for them, even to the drawing of live frogs out of his ears. But after a while they turned on him, and said his tricks were dull and a shade unholy, and set the cross on his shoulders again. Another half-mile on the way, and he asked them to stop and hear him jest for them, for he knew, he said, all the jests of Conan the Bald, upon whose back a sheep's wool grew. And the young friars, when they had heard his merry tales, again bade him take up his cross, for it ill became them to listen to such follies. Another half-mile on the way, he asked them to stop and hear him sing the story of white-breasted Deirdre, and how she endured many sorrows, and how the sons of Usnett died to serve her. And the young friars were mad to hear him, but when he had ended they grew angry, and beat him for waking forgotten longings in their hearts. So they set the cross upon his back and hurried him to the hill. When he was come to the top, they took the cross from him, and began to dig a hole to stand it in, while the beggars gathered round, and talked among themselves. I ask a favour before I die, says Cumhal. We will grant you no more delays, says the abbot. I ask no more delays, for I have drawn the sword, and told the truth, and lived my vision, and am content. Would you, then, confess? By sun and moon, not I. I ask but to be let eat the food I carry in my wallet. I carry food in my wallet whenever I go upon a journey, but I do not taste of it unless I am well-nigh starved. I have not eaten now these 2 days. You may eat, then, says the abbot, and he turned to help the friars dig the hole. The gleeman took a loaf and some strips of cold fried bacon out of his wallet and laid them upon the ground. I will give a tithe to the poor, says he, and he cut a 10th part from the loaf and the bacon. Who among you is the poorest? And thereupon was a great clamour, for the beggars began the history of their sorrows and their poverty, and their yellow faces swayed like Garra Loch when the floods have filled it with water from the bogs. He listened for a little, and, says he, I am myself the poorest, for I have travelled the bare road, and by the edges of the sea. And the tattered doublet of party-coloured cloth upon my back and the torn pointed shoes upon my feet have ever irked me, because of the towered city full of noble raiment which was in my heart. And I have been the more alone upon the roads and by the sea because I heard in my heart the rustling of the rose-bordered dress of her who is more subtle than Angus, the subtle-hearted, and more full of the beauty of laughter than Conan the Bald. And more full of the wisdom of tears than white-breasted Deirdre, and more lovely than a bursting dawn to them that are lost in the darkness. Therefore, I award the tithe to myself, but yet, because I am done with all things, I give it unto you. So he flung the bread and the strips of bacon among the beggars, and they fought with many cries until the last scrap was eaten. But meanwhile the friars nailed the gleeman to his cross, and set it upright in the hole, and shovelled the earth in at the foot, and trampled it level and hard. So then they went away, but the beggars stared on, sitting round the cross. But when the sun was sinking, they also got up to go, for the air was getting chilly. And as soon as they had gone a little way, the wolves, who had been showing themselves on the edge of a neighbouring coppice, came nearer, and the birds wheeled closer and closer. "Stay, outcasts, yet a little while," the crucified one called in a weak voice to the beggars, "and keep the beasts and the birds from me." But the beggars were angry because he had called them outcasts, so they threw stones and mud at him, and went their way. Then the wolves gathered at the foot of the cross, and the birds flew lower and lower. And presently the birds lighted all at once upon his head and arms and shoulders, and began to peck at him, and the wolves began to eat his feet. "Outcasts," he moaned, "have you also turned against the outcast? Out of the rows." One winter evening an old knight in rusted chain armor rode slowly along the woody southern slope of Ben Bulben, watching the sun go down in crimson clouds over the sea. His horse was tired, as after a long journey, and he had upon his helmet the crest of no neighboring lord or king, but a small rose made of rubies that glimmered every moment to a deeper crimson. His white hair fell in thin curls upon his shoulders, and its disorder added to the melancholy of his face, which was the face of one of those who have come but seldom into the world, and always for its trouble. The dreamers who must do what they dream, the doers who must dream what they do. After gazing a while towards the sun, he let the reins fall upon the neck of his horse, and, stretching out both arms towards the west, he said, "O divine rose of intellectual flame, let the gates of thy peace be open to me at last." And suddenly a loud squealing began in the wood some hundreds of yards further up the mountainside. He stopped his horse to listen, and heard behind him a sound of feet and of voices. "They are beating them to make them go into the narrow path by the gorge," said someone, and in another moment a dozen peasants armed with short spears had come up with the knight and stood a little apart from him, their blue caps in their hands. "Where do you go with the spears?" he asked. And one who seemed the leader answered, "A troop of wood thieves came down from the hills a while ago and carried off the pigs belonging to an old man who lives by Glen Carlock, and we turned out to go after them. Now that we know they are 4 times more than we are, we follow to find the way they have taken, and will presently tell our story to de Courcy, and if he will not help us, to Fitzgerald. For de Courcy and Fitzgerald have lately made a peace, and we do not know to whom we belong. But by that time," said the knight, "the pigs will have been eaten. A dozen men cannot do more, and it was not reasonable that the whole valley should turn out and risk their lives for 2, or for 2 dozen pigs. Can you tell me," said the knight, "if the old man to whom the pigs belong is pious and true of heart?" "He is as true as another and more pious than any, for he says a prayer to a saint every morning before his breakfast." "Then it were well to fight in his cause," said the knight, "and if you will fight against the wood thieves I will take the main brunt of the battle, and you know well that a man in armor is worth many like these wood thieves, clad in wool and leather." And the leader turned to his fellows and asked if they would take the chance, but they seemed anxious to get back to their cabins. "Are the wood thieves treacherous and impious?" "They are treacherous in all their dealings," said a peasant, "and no man has known them to pray." "Then," said the knight, "I will give 5 crowns for the head of every wood thief killed by us in the fighting." And he bid the leader show the way, and they all went on together. After a time they came to where a beaten track wound into the woods, and, taking this, they doubled back upon their previous course, and began to ascend the wooded slope of the mountains. In a little while the path grew very straight and steep, and the knight was forced to dismount and leave his horse tied to a tree stem. They knew they were on the right track, for they could see the marks of pointed shoes in the soft clay and mingled with them the cloven footprints of the pigs. Presently the path became still more abrupt, and they knew by the ending of the cloven footprints that the thieves were carrying the pigs. Now and then a long mark in the clay showed that a pig had slipped down, and been dragged along for a little way. They had journeyed thus for about 20 minutes, when a confused sound of voices told them that they were coming up with the thieves. And then the voices ceased, and they understood that they had been overheard in their turn. They pressed on rapidly and cautiously, and in about 5 minutes one of them caught sight of a leather jerkin half hidden by a hazel bush. An arrow struck the knight's chain armor, but glanced off harmlessly, and then a flight of arrows swept by them with the buzzing sound of great bees. They ran and climbed, and ran towards the thieves, who were now all visible standing up among the bushes with their still quivering bows in their hands, for they had only their spears and they must at once come hand to hand. The knight was in the front and smote down first one and then another of the wood thieves. The peasants shouted, and, pressing on, drove the wood thieves before them until they came out on the flat top of the mountain, and there they saw the two pigs quietly grubbing in the short grass, so they ran about them in a circle, and began to move back again towards the narrow path, the old knight coming now the last of all, and striking down thief after thief. The peasants had got no very serious hurts among them, for he had drawn the brunt of the battle upon himself, as could well be seen from the bloody rents in his armor. And when they came to the entrance of the narrow path he bade them drive the pigs down into the valley, while he stood there to guard the way behind them. So in a moment he was alone, and, being weak with loss of blood, might have been ended there and then by the wood thieves he had beaten off, had fear not made them begone out of sight in a great hurry. An hour passed, and they did not return. And now the knight could stand on guard no longer, but had to lie down upon the grass. A half-hour more went by, and then a young lad with what appeared to be a number of cock's feathers stuck round his hat, came out of the path behind him, and began to move about among the dead thieves, cutting their heads off. Then he laid the heads in a heap before the knight, and said, "O great knight, I have been bid come and ask you for the crowns you promised for the heads, 5 crowns a head. They bid me tell you that they have prayed to God and his mother to give you a long life, but that they are poor peasants, and that they would have the money before you die. They told me this over and over for fear I might forget it, and promised to beat me if I did." The knight raised himself upon his elbow, and opening a bag that hung to his belt, counted out the 5 crowns for each head. There were 30 heads in all. "O great knight," said the lad, "they have also bid me take all care of you, and light a fire, and put this ointment upon your wounds." And he gathered sticks and leaves together, and, flashing his flint and steel under a mass of dry leaves, had made a very good blaze. Then, drawing of the coat of mail, he began to anoint the wounds, but he did it clumsily, like one who does by rote what he had been told. The knight motioned him to stop, and said, "You seem a good lad. I would ask something of you for myself." "There are still a few crowns," said the knight, "shall I give them to you?" "Oh no," said the lad. "They would be no good to me. There is only one thing that I care about doing, and I have no need of money to do it. I go from village to village and from hill to hill, and whenever I come across a good cock I steal him and take him into the woods, and I keep him there under a basket until I get another good cock, and then I set them to fight. The people say I am an innocent, and do not do me any harm, and never ask me to do any work but go a message now and then. It is because I am an innocent that they send me to get the crowns, anyone else would steal them. And they dare not come back themselves, for now that you are not with them they are afraid of the wood thieves. Did you ever hear how, when the wood thieves are christened, the wolves are made their godfathers, and their right arms are not christened at all? If you will not take these crowns, my good lad, I have nothing for you, I fear, unless you would have that old coat of mail which I shall soon need no more." "There was something I wanted, yes, I remember now," said the lad. "I want you to tell me why you fought like the champions and giants in the stories and for so little a thing. Are you indeed a man like us? Are you not rather an old wizard who lives among these hills, and will not a wind arise presently and crumble you into dust?" "I will tell you of myself," replied the knight, "for now that I am the last of the fellowship, I may tell all and witness for God. Look at the rows of rubies on my helmet, and see the symbol of my life and of my hope." And then he told the lad this story, but with always more frequent pauses. And, while he told it, the rose shone a deep blood color in the firelight, and the lad stuck the cock's feathers in the earth in front of him, and moved them about as though he made them actors in the play. "I live in a land far from this, and was one of the Knights of St. John," said the old man, "but I was one of those in the order who always longed for more arduous labors in the service of the Most High. At last there came to us a knight of Palestine, to whom the truth of truths had been revealed by God himself. He had seen a great rose of fire, and a voice out of the rose had told him how men would turn from the light of their own hearts, and bow down before outer order and outer fixity, and that then the light would cease. And none escaped the curse except the foolish good man who could not, and the passionate wicked man who would not, think. Already, the voice told him, the wayward light of the heart was shining out upon the world to keep it alive, with a less clear luster, and that, as it paled, a strange infection was touching the stars and the hills and the grass and the trees with corruption, and that none of those who had seen clearly the truth and the ancient way could enter into the kingdom of God, which is in the heart of the rose, if they stayed unwillingly in the corrupted world. And so they must prove their anger against the powers of corruption by dying in the service of the rose of God. While the Knight of Palestine was telling us these things, we seemed to see in a vision a crimson rose spreading itself about him, so that he seemed to speak out of its heart, and the air was filled with fragrance. By this we knew that it was the very voice of God which spoke to us by the night, and we gathered about him and bade him direct us in all things, and teach us how to obey the voice. So he bound us with an oath, and gave us signs and words whereby we might know each other even after many years, and he appointed places of meeting, and he sent us out in troops into the world to seek good causes, and die in doing battle for them. At first we thought to die more readily by fasting to death in honor of some saint. But this he told us was evil, for we did it for the sake of death, and thus took out of the hands of God the choice of the time and manner of our death, and by so doing made his power the less. We must choose our service for its excellence, and for this alone, and leave it to God to reward us at his own time and in his own manner. And after this he compelled us to eat always two at a table to watch each other lest we fasted unduly, for some among us said that if one fasted for a love of the holiness of saints and then died, the death would be acceptable. And the years passed, and one by one my fellows died in the Holy Land, or in warring upon the evil princes of the earth, or in clearing the roads of robbers, and among them died the Knight of Palestine, and at last I was alone. I fought in every cause where the few contended against the many, and my hair grew white, and a terrible fear lest I had fallen under the displeasure of God came upon me. But, hearing at last how this western isle was fuller of wars and rapine than any other land, I came hither, and I have found the thing I sought, and, behold, I am filled with a great joy. Thereat he began to sing in Latin, and, while he sang, his voice grew fainter and fainter. Then his eyes closed, and his lips fell apart, and the lad knew he was dead. He has told me a good tale, he said, for there was fighting in it, but I did not understand much of it, and it is hard to remember so long a story. And, taking the knight's sword, he began to dig a grave in the soft clay. He dug hard, and a faint light of dawn had touched his hair and he had almost done his work when a cock crowed in the valley below. Ah, he said, I must have that bird, and he ran down the narrow path to the valley. The wisdom of the king. The High Queen of the island of woods had died in childbirth, and her child was put to nurse with a woman who lived in a hut of mud and wicker, within the border of the wood. One night the woman sat rocking the cradle, and pondering over the beauty of the child, and praying that the gods might grant him wisdom equal to his beauty. There came a knock at the door, and she got up, not a little wondering, for the nearest neighbors were in the dun of the High King a mile away, and the night was now late. Who is knocking? She cried, and a thin voice answered, Open. For I am a crone of the grey hawk, and I come from the darkness of the great wood. In terror she drew back the bolt, and a grey-clad woman, of a great age, and of a height more than human, came in and stood by the head of the cradle. The nurse shrank back against the wall, unable to take her eyes from the woman, for she saw by the gleaming of the firelight that the feathers of the grey hawk were upon her head instead of hair. But the child slept, and the fire danced, for the one was too ignorant and the other too full of gaiety to know what a dreadful being stood there. Open! Cried another voice, for I am a crone of the grey hawk, and I watch over his nest in the darkness of the great wood. The nurse opened the door again, though her fingers could scarce hold the bolts for trembling, and another grey woman, not less old than the other, and with like feathers instead of hair, came in and stood by the first. In a little, came a third grey woman, and after her a fourth, and then another and another and another, until the hut was full of their immense bodies. They stood a long time in perfect silence and stillness, for they were of those whom the dropping of the sand has never troubled, but at last one muttered in a low thin voice, Sisters. I knew him far away by the redness of his heart under his silver skin. And then another spoke, "Sisters, I knew him because his heart fluttered like a bird under a net of silver cords," and then another took up the word, "Sisters, I knew him because his heart sang like a bird that is happy in a silver cage." And after that they sang together, those who were nearest rocking the cradle with long wrinkled fingers. And their voices were now tender and caressing, now like the wind blowing in the great wood, and this was their song. Out of sight is out of mind. Long have man and womankind. Heavy of will and light of mood. Taken away our wheaten food. Taken away our altar stone. Hail and rain and thunder alone. And red hearts we turn to grey. Are true till time gutter away. When the song had died out, the crone who had first spoken, said, "We have nothing more to do but to mix a drop of our blood into his blood." And she scratched her arm with the sharp point of a spindle, which she had made the nurse bring to her, and let a drop of blood, grey as the mist, fall upon the lips of the child, and passed out into the darkness. Then the others passed out in silence one by one. And all the while the child had not opened his pink eyelids or the fire ceased to dance, for the one was too ignorant and the other too full of gaiety to know what great beings had bent over the cradle. When the crones were gone, the nurse came to her courage again, and hurried to the dun of the High King, and cried out in the midst of the assembly hall that the city, whether for good or evil she knew not, had bent over the child that night. And the king and his poets and men of law, and his huntsmen, and his cooks, and his chief warriors went with her to the hut and gathered about the cradle, and were as noisy as magpies, and the child sat up and looked at them. 2 years passed over, and the king died fighting against the fair Balg. And the poets and the men of law ruled in the name of the child, but looked to see him become the master himself before long, for no one had seen so wise a child. And tales of his endless questions about the household of the gods and the making of the world went hither and thither among the wicker houses of the poor. Everything had been well but for a miracle that began to trouble all men, and all women, who, indeed, talked of it without ceasing. The feathers of the grey hawk had begun to grow in the child's hair, and though his nurse cut them continually, in but a little while they would be more numerous than ever. This had not been a matter of great moment, for miracles were a little thing in those days, but for an ancient law of Eri that none who had any blemish of body could sit upon the throne. And as a grey hawk was a wild thing of the air which had never sat at the board, or listened to the songs of the poets in the light of the fire, it was not possible to think of one in whose hair its feathers grew as other than marred and blasted. Nor could the people separate from their admiration of the wisdom that grew in him a horror as at one of unhuman blood. Yet all were resolved that he should reign, for they had suffered much from foolish kings and their own disorders, and moreover they desired to watch out the spectacle of his days. And no one had any other fear but that his great wisdom might bid him obey the law, and call some other, who had but a common mind, to reign in his stead. When the child was 7 years old the poets and the men of law were called together by the chief poet, and all these matters weighed and considered. The child had already seen that those about him had hair only, and, though they had told him that they too had feathers but had lost them because of a sin committed by their forefathers, they knew that he would learn the truth when he began to wander into the country round about. After much consideration they decreed a new law commanding every one upon pain of death to mingle artificially the feathers of the grey hawk into his hair. And they sent men with nets and slings and bows into the countries round about to gather a sufficiency of feathers. They decreed also that any who told the truth to the child should be flung from a cliff into the sea. The years passed, and the child grew from childhood into boyhood and from boyhood into manhood, and from being curious about all things he became busy with strange and subtle thoughts which came to him in dreams. And with distinctions between things long held the same and with the resemblance of things long held different. Multitudes came from other lands to see him and to ask his counsel, but there were guards set at the frontiers, who compelled all that came to wear the feathers of the grey hawk in their hair. While they listened to him his words seemed to make all darkness light and filled their hearts like music. But, alas, when they returned to their own lands his words seemed far off, and what they could remember too strange and subtle to help them to live out their hasty days. A number indeed did live differently afterwards, but their new life was less excellent than the old. Some among them had long served a good cause, but when they heard him praise it and their labor, they returned to their own lands to find what they had loved less lovable and their arm lighter in the battle, for he had taught them how little a hair divides the false and true. Others, again, who had served no cause, but wrought in peace the welfare of their own households, when he had expounded the meaning of their purpose, found their bones softer and they were less ready for toil. For he had shown them greater purposes. And numbers of the young, when they had heard him upon all these things, remembered certain words that became like a fire in their hearts, and made all kindly joys and traffic between man and man as nothing, and went different ways. But all into vague regret. When any asked him concerning the common things of life, disputes about the mere of a territory, or about the straying of cattle, or about the penalty of blood, he would turn to those nearest him for advice. But this was held to be from courtesy, for none knew that these matters were hidden from him by thoughts and dreams that filled his mind like the marching and countermarching of armies. Far less could any know that his heart wandered lost amid throngs of overcoming thoughts and dreams, shuddering at its own consuming solitude. Among those who came to look at him and to listen to him was the daughter of a little king who lived a great way off, and when he saw her he loved, for she was beautiful, with a strange and pale beauty unlike the women of his land. But Dana, the great mother, had decreed her a heart that was but as the heart of others, and when she considered the mystery of the hawk feathers she was troubled with a great horror. He called her to him when the assembly was over and told her of her beauty, and praised her simply and frankly as though she were a fable of the bards, and he asked her humbly to give him her love, for he was only subtle in his dreams. Overwhelmed with his greatness, she half consented, and yet half refused, for she longed to marry some warrior who could carry her over a mountain in his arms. Day by day the king gave her gifts. Cups with ears of gold and findriny wrought by the craftsmen of distant lands, cloth from oversea, which, though woven with curious figures, seemed to her less beautiful than the bright cloth of her own country. And still she was ever between a smile and a frown, between yielding and withholding. He laid down his wisdom at her feet, and told how the heroes when they die return to the world and begin their labor anew. How the kind and mirthful men of Dea drove out the huge and gloomy and misshapen people from under the sea. And a multitude of things that even the city have forgotten, either because they happened so long ago or because they have not time to think of them. And still she half refused, and still he hoped, because he could not believe that a beauty so much like wisdom could hide a common heart. There was a tall young man in the dun who had yellow hair, and was skilled in wrestling and in the training of horses. And one day when the king walked in the orchard, which was between the fosse and the forest, he heard his voice among the sally bushes which hid the waters of the fosse. "My blossom," it said, "I hate them for making you weave these dingy feathers into your beautiful hair, and all that the bird of prey upon the throne may sleep easy o' nights." And then the low, musical voice he loved answered, "My hair is not beautiful like yours, and now that I have plucked the feathers out of your hair I will put my hands through it, thus, and thus, and thus. For it casts no shadow of terror and darkness upon my heart." Then the king remembered many things that he had forgotten without understanding them, doubtful words of his poets and his men of law, doubts that he had reasoned away, his own continual solitude, and he called to the lovers in a trembling voice. They came from among the sally bushes and threw themselves at his feet and prayed for pardon, and he stooped down and plucked the feathers out of the hair of the woman and then turned away towards the dun without a word. He strode into the hall of assembly, and having gathered his poets and his men of law about him, stood upon the dais and spoke in a loud, clear voice, "Men of law, why did you make me sin against the laws of Eri? Men of verse, why did you make me sin against the secrecy of wisdom? For law was made by man for the welfare of man, but wisdom the gods have made, and no man shall live by its light. For it and the hail and the rain and the thunder follow a way that is deadly to mortal things. Men of law and men of verse, live according to your kind, and call Ioka of the hasty mind to reign over you, for I set out to find my kindred." He then came down among them, and drew out of the hair of first one and then another the feathers of the grey hawk, and, having scattered them over the rushes upon the floor, passed out, and none dared to follow him. For his eyes gleamed like the eyes of the birds of prey. And no man saw him again or heard his voice. Some believed that he found his eternal abode among the demons, and some that he dwelt henceforth with the dark and dreadful goddesses, who sit all night about the pools and the forest watching the constellations rising and setting in those desolate mirrors. The Heart of the Spring. A very old man, whose face was almost as fleshless as the foot of a bird, sat meditating upon the rocky shore of the flat and hazel-covered isle which fills the widest part of the Loch Gill. A russet-faced boy of 17 years sat by his side, watching the swallows dipping for flies in the still water. The old man was dressed in threadbare blue velvet, and the boy wore a frieze coat and a blue cap, and had about his neck a rosary of blue beads. Behind the two, and half hidden by trees, was a little monastery. It had been burned down a long while before by sacrilegious men of the Queen's party, but had been roofed anew with rushes by the boy, that the old man might find shelter in his last days. He had not set his spade, however, into the garden about it, and the lilies and the roses of the monks had spread out until their confused luxuriancy met and mingled with the narrowing circle of the fern. Beyond the lilies and the roses the ferns were so deep that a child walking among them would be hidden from sight, even though he stood upon his toes, and beyond the fern rose many hazels and small oak trees. "Master," said the boy, "this long fasting, and the labor of beckoning after nightfall with your rod of quickened wood to the beings who dwell in the waters and among the hazels and oak trees, is too much for your strength. Rest from all this labor for a little, for your hands seemed more heavy upon my shoulder and your feet less steady under you today than I have known them. Men say that you are older than the eagles, and yet you will not seek the rest that belongs to age." He spoke in an eager, impulsive way, as though his heart were in the words and thoughts of the moment. And the old man answered slowly and deliberately, as though his heart were in distant days and distant deeds. "I will tell you why I have not been able to rest," he said. "It is right that you should know, for you have served me faithfully these 5 years and more, and even with affection, taking away thereby a little of the doom of loneliness which always falls upon the wise. Now, too, that the end of my labor and the triumph of my hopes is at hand, it is the more needful for you to have this knowledge. Master, do not think that I would question you. It is for me to keep the fire alight, and the thatch close against the rain, and strong, lest the wind blow it among the trees. And it is for me to take the heavy books from the shelves, and to lift from its corner the great painted roll with the names of the Sidhi, and to possess the while an incurious and reverent heart. For right well I know that God has made out of his abundance a separate wisdom for everything which lives, and to do these things is my wisdom." "You are afraid," said the old man, and his eyes shone with a momentary anger. "Sometimes at night," said the boy, "when you are reading, with the rod of quickened wood in your hand, I look out of the door and see, now a great grey man driving swine among the hazels. And now many little people in red caps who come out of the lake driving little white cows before them. I do not fear these little people so much as the grey man, for, when they come near the house, they milk the cows, and they drink the frothing milk, and begin to dance, and I know there is good in the heart that loves dancing. But I fear them for all that. And I fear the tall white-armed ladies who come out of the air, and move slowly hither and thither, crowning themselves with the roses or with the lilies, and shaking about their living hair, which moves, for so I have heard them tell each other, with the motion of their thoughts, now spreading out and now gathering close to their heads. They have mild, beautiful faces, but, Angus, son of Forbes, I fear all these beings, I fear the people of Sidhi, and I fear the art which draws them about us." "Why," said the old man, "do you fear the ancient gods who made the spears of your fathers' fathers to be stout in battle, and the little people who came at night from the depth of the lakes and sang among the crickets upon their hearths? And in our evil day they still watch over the loveliness of the earth. But I must tell you why I have fasted and labored when others would sink into the sleep of age, for without your help once more I shall have fasted and labored to no good end. When you have done for me this last thing, you may go and build your cottage and till your fields, and take some girl to wife, and forget the ancient gods. I have saved all the gold and silver pieces that were given to me by earls and knights and squires for keeping them from the evil eye and from the love-weaving enchantments of witches. And by earls and knights and squires ladies for keeping the people of the city from making the udders of their cattle fall dry, and taking the butter from their churns. I have saved it all for the day when my work should be at an end, and now that the end is at hand you shall not lack for gold and silver pieces enough to make strong the roof tree of your cottage and to keep cellar and larder full. I have sought through all my life to find the secret of life. I was not happy in my youth, for I knew that it would pass, and I was not happy in my manhood, for I knew that age was coming. And so I gave myself, in youth and manhood and age, to the search for the great secret. I longed for a life whose abundance would fill centuries, I scorned the life of fourscore winters. I would be, nay, I will be, like the ancient gods of the land. I read in my youth, in a Hebrew manuscript I found in a Spanish monastery, that there is a moment after the sun has entered the ram and before he has passed the lion, which trembles with the song of the immortal powers. And that whosoever finds this moment and listens to the song shall become like the immortal powers themselves. I came back to Ireland and asked the fairy men, and the cow doctors, if they knew when this moment was, but though all had heard of it, there was none could find the moment upon the hourglass. So I gave myself to magic, and spent my life in fasting and in labor that I might bring the gods and the fairies to my side, and now at last one of the fairies has told me that the moment is at hand. One, who wore a red cap and whose lips were white with the froth of the new milk, whispered it into my ear. Tomorrow, a little before the close of the first hour after dawn, I shall find the moment, and then I will go away to a southern land and build myself a palace of white marble amid orange trees, and gather the brave and the beautiful about me, and enter into the eternal kingdom of my youth. But, that I may hear the whole song, I was told by the little fellow with the froth of the new milk on his lips, that you must bring great masses of green boughs and pile them about the door and the window of my room. And you must put fresh green rushes upon the floor, and cover the table and the rushes with the roses and the lilies of the monks. You must do this tonight, and in the morning at the end of the first hour after dawn, you must come and find me. Will you be quite young then? Said the boy. I will be as young then as you are, but now I am still old and tired, and you must help me to my chair and to my books. When the boy had left Angus son of Forbes in his room, and had lighted the lamp which, by some contrivance of the wizards, gave forth a sweet odor as of strange flowers, he went into the wood and began cutting green boughs from the hazels, and great bundles of rushes from the western border of the isle, where the small rocks gave place to gently sloping sand and clay. It was nightfall before he had cut enough for his purpose, and well nigh midnight before he had carried the last bundle to its place, and gone back for the roses and the lilies. It was one of those warm, beautiful nights when everything seems carved of precious stones. Sleuthwood away to the south looked as though cut out of green beryl, and the waters that mirrored them shone like pale opal. The roses he was gathering were like glowing rubies, and the lilies had the dull luster of pearl. Everything had taken upon itself the look of something imperishable, except a glowworm, whose faint flame burnt on steadily among the shadows, moving slowly hither and thither, the only thing that seemed alive. The only thing that seemed perishable as mortal hope. The boy gathered a great armful of roses and lilies, and thrusting the glowworm among their pearl and ruby, carried them into the room, where the old man sat in a half-slumber. He laid armful after armful upon the floor and above the table, and then, gently closing the door, threw himself upon his bed of rushes, to dream of a peaceful manhood with his chosen wife at his side, and the laughter of children in his ears. At dawn he rose, and went down to the edge of the lake, taking the hourglass with him. He put some bread and a flask of wine in the boat, that his master might not lack food at the outset of his journey, and then sat down to wait until the hour from dawn had gone by. Gradually the birds began to sing, and when the last grains of sand were falling, everything suddenly seemed to overflow with their music. It was the most beautiful and living moment of the year, one could listen to the spring's heart beating in it. He got up and went to find his master. The green boughs filled the door, and he had to make a way through them. When he entered the room the sunlight was falling in flickering circles on floor and walls and table, and everything was full of soft green shadows. But the old man sat clasping a mass of roses and lilies in his arms, and with his head sunk upon his breast. On the table, at his left hand, was a leathern wallet full of gold and silver pieces, as for a journey, and at his right hand was a long staff. The boy touched him and he did not move. He lifted the hands but they were quite cold, and they fell heavily. "It were better for him," said the lad, "to have told his beads and said his prayers like another, and not to have spent his days in seeking amongst the immortal powers what he could have found in his own deeds and days had he willed. Ah, yes, it were better to have said his prayers and kissed his beads." He looked at the threadbare blue velvet, and he saw it was covered with the pollen of the flowers, and while he was looking at it a thrush, who had alighted among the boughs that were piled against the window, began to sing. The curse of the fires and of the shadows. One summer night, when there was peace, a score of Puritan troopers under the pious Sir Frederick Hamilton broke through the door of the Abbey of the White Friars which stood over the Garra Loch at Sligo. As the door fell with a crash they saw a little knot of friars, gathered about the altar, their white habits glimmering in the steady light of the holy candles. All the monks were kneeling except the abbot, who stood upon the altar steps with a great brazen crucifix in his hand. "Shoot them!" cried Sir Frederick Hamilton, but none stirred, for all were new converts, and feared the crucifix and the holy candles. The white lights from the altar threw the shadows of the troopers up onto roof and wall. As the troopers moved about, the shadows began a fantastic dance among the corbels and the memorial tablets. For a little while all was silent, and then 5 troopers who were the bodyguard of Sir Frederick Hamilton lifted their muskets, and shot down 5 of the friars. The noise and the smoke drove away the mystery of the pale altar lights, and the other troopers took courage and began to strike. In a moment the friars lay about the altar steps, their white habits stained with blood. "Set fire to the house!" cried Sir Frederick Hamilton, and at his word one went out, and came in again carrying a heap of dry straw, and piled it against the western wall, and, having done this, fell back. For the fear of the crucifix and of the holy candles was still in his heart. Seeing this, the 5 troopers who were Sir Frederick Hamilton's bodyguard darted forward, and taking each a holy candle set the straw in a blaze. The red tongues of fire rushed up and flickered from corbel to corbel and from tablet to tablet, and crept along the floor, setting in a blaze the seats and benches. The dance of the shadows passed away, and the dance of the fires began. The troopers fell back towards the door in the southern wall, and watched those yellow dancers springing hither and thither. For a time the altar stood safe and apart in the midst of its white light, the eyes of the troopers turned upon it. The abbot whom they had thought dead had risen to his feet and now stood before it with the crucifix lifted in both hands high above his head. Suddenly he cried with a loud voice, "Woe unto all who smite those who dwell within the light of the Lord, for they shall wander among the ungovernable shadows, and follow the ungovernable fires." And having so cried he fell on his face dead, and the brazen crucifix rolled down the steps of the altar. The smoke had now grown very thick, so that it drove the troopers out into the open air. Before them were burning houses. Behind them shone the painted windows of the abbey filled with saints and martyrs, awakened, as from a sacred trance, into an angry and animated life. The eyes of the troopers were dazzled, and for a while could see nothing but the flaming faces of saints and martyrs. Presently, however, they saw a man covered with dust who came running towards them. "2 messengers," he cried, "have been sent by the defeated Irish to raise against you the whole country about Manor Hamilton, and if you do not stop them you will be overpowered in the woods before you reach home again. They ride northeast between Ben Bulben and Cashel na Gael." Sir Frederick Hamilton called to him the 5 troopers who had first fired upon the monks and said, "Mount quickly, and ride through the woods towards the mountain, and get before these men, and kill them." In a moment the troopers were gone, and before many moments they had splashed across the river at what is now called Buckley's Ford, and plunged into the woods. They followed a beaten track that wound along the northern bank of the river. The boughs of the birch and quicken trees mingled above, and hid the cloudy moonlight, leaving the pathway in almost complete darkness. They rode at a rapid trot, now chatting together, now watching some stray weasel or rabbit scuttling away in the darkness. Gradually, as the gloom and silence of the woods oppressed them, they drew closer together, and began to talk rapidly. They were old comrades and knew each other's lives. One was married, and told how glad his wife would be to see him return safe from this harebrained expedition against the White Friars, and to hear how fortune had made amends for rashness. The oldest of the five, whose wife was dead, spoke of a flagon of wine which awaited him upon an upper shelf. While a third, who was the youngest, had a sweetheart watching for his return, and he rode a little way before the others, not talking at all. Suddenly the young man stopped, and they saw that his horse was trembling. "I saw something," he said, "and yet I do not know, but it may have been one of the shadows. It looked like a great worm with a silver crown upon his head." One of the five put his hand up to his forehead as if about to cross himself, but remembering that he had changed his religion he put it down, and said, "I am certain it was but a shadow, for there are a great many about us. And of very strange kinds." Then they rode on in silence. It had been raining in the earlier part of the day, and the drops fell from the branches, wetting their hair and their shoulders. In a little they began to talk again. They had been in many battles against many a rebel together, and now told each other over again the story of their wounds, and so awakened in their hearts the strongest of all fellowships, the fellowship of the sword. And half forgot the terrible solitude of the woods. Suddenly the first two horses neighed, and then stood still, and would go no further. Before them was a glint of water, and they knew by the rushing sound that it was a river. They dismounted, and after much tugging and coaxing brought the horses to the river side. In the midst of the water stood a tall old woman with grey hair flowing over a grey dress. She stood up to her knees in the water, and stooped from time to time as though washing. Presently they could see that she was washing something that half floated. The moon cast a flickering light upon it, and they saw that it was the dead body of a man, and, while they were looking at it, an eddy of the river turned the face towards them. And each of the five troopers recognized at the same moment his own face. While they stood dumb and motionless with horror, the woman began to speak, saying slowly and loudly, "Did you see my son? He has a crown of silver on his head, and there are rubies in the crown." Then the oldest of the troopers, he who had been most often wounded, drew his sword and cried, "I have fought for the truth of my God, and need not fear the shadows of Satan," and with that rushed into the water. In a moment he returned. The woman had vanished, and though he had thrust his sword into air and water he had found nothing. The five troopers remounted, and set their horses at the ford, but all to no purpose. They tried again and again, and went plunging hither and thither, the horses foaming and rearing. "Let us," said the old trooper, "ride back a little into the wood, and strike the river higher up." They rode in under the boughs, the ground ivy crackling under the hoofs, and the branches striking against their steel caps. After about 20 minutes riding they came out again upon the river, and after another 10 minutes found a place where it was possible to cross without sinking below the stirrups. The wood upon the other side was very thin, and broke the moonlight into long streams. The wind had arisen, and had begun to drive the clouds rapidly across the face of the moon, so that thin streams of light seemed to be dancing a grotesque dance among the scattered bushes and small fir trees. The tops of the trees began also to moan, and the sound of it was like the voice of the dead in the wind. And the troopers remembered the belief that tells how the dead in purgatory are spitted upon the points of the trees and upon the points of the rocks. They turned a little to the south, in the hope that they might strike the beaten path again, but they could find no trace of it. Meanwhile, the moaning grew louder and louder, and the dance of the white moon fires more and more rapid. Gradually they began to be aware of a sound of distant music. It was the sound of a bagpipe, and they rode towards it with great joy. It came from the bottom of a deep, cup-like hollow. In the midst of the hollow was an old man with a red cap and withered face. He sat beside a fire of sticks, and had a burning torch thrust into the earth at his feet, and played an old bagpipe furiously. His red hair dripped over his face like the iron rust upon a rock. "Did you see my wife?" he cried, looking up a moment. "She was washing. She was washing." "I am afraid of him," said the young trooper, "I fear he is one of the Sidhe." "No," said the old trooper, "he is a man, for I can see the sun freckles upon his face. We will compel him to be our guide," and at that he drew his sword, and the others did the same. They stood in a ring round the piper, and pointed their swords at him, and the old trooper then told him that they must kill 2 rebels, who had taken the road between Ben Bulben and the great mountain spur that is called Cashel-na-Gael. And that he must get up before one of them and be their guide, for they had lost their way. The piper turned, and pointed to a neighboring tree, and they saw an old white horse ready bit, bridled, and saddled. He slung the pipe across his back, and, taking the torch in his hand, got upon the horse, and started off before them, as hard as he could go. The wood grew thinner and thinner, and the ground began to slope up toward the mountain. The moon had already set, and the little white flames of the stars had come out everywhere. The ground sloped more and more until at last they rode far above the woods upon the wide top of the mountain. The woods lay spread out mile after mile below, and away to the south shot up the red glare of the burning town. But before and above them were the little white flames. The guide drew rein suddenly, and pointing upwards with the hand that did not hold the torch, shrieked out, "Look, look at the holy candles," and then plunged forward at a gallop, waving the torch hither and thither. "Do you hear the hoofs of the messengers?" cried the guide. "Quick, quick! Or they will be gone out of your hands," and he laughed as with delight of the chase. The troopers thought they could hear far off, and as if below them, rattle of hoofs. But now the ground began to slope more and more, and the speed grew more headlong moment by moment. They tried to pull up, but in vain, for the horses seemed to have gone mad. The guide had thrown the reins on to the neck of the old white horse, and was waving his arms and singing a wild Gaelic song. Suddenly they saw the thin gleam of a river, at an immense distance below, and knew that they were upon the brink of the abyss that is now called Lugna-Gael, or in English the Stranger's Leap. The 6 horses sprang forward, and 5 screams went up into the air. A moment later 5 men and horses fell with a dull crash upon the green slopes at the foot of the rocks. The old men of the Twilight. At the place, close to the Dead Man's Point, at the Rosses, where the disused pilot-house looks out to sea through 2 round windows like eyes, a mud cottage stood in the last century. It also was a watch-house, for a certain old Michael Bruin, who had been a smuggler in his day, and was still the father and grandfather of smugglers, lived there, and when, after nightfall, a tall schooner crept over the bay from Roughly. It was his business to hang a horn lantern in the southern window, that the news might travel to Doran's Island, and from thence, by another horn lantern, to the village of the Rosses. But for this glimmering of messages, he had little communion with mankind, for he was very old, and had no thought for anything but for the making of his soul, at the foot of the Spanish crucifix of carved oak that hung by his chimney. Or bent double over the rosary of stone beads brought to him a cargo of silks and laces out of France. One night he had watched hour after hour, because a gentle and favourable wind was blowing, and La Mire de Miséricorde was much overdue. And he was about to lie down upon his heap of straw, seeing that the dawn was widening the east, and that the schooner would not dare to round roughly and come to an anchor after daybreak. When he saw a long line of herons flying slowly from Doran's Island and towards the pools which lie, half choked with reeds, behind what is called the Second Rosses. He had never before seen herons flying over the sea, for they are shore-keeping birds, and partly because this had startled him out of his drowsiness, and more because the long delay of the schooner kept his cupboard empty. He took down his rusty shotgun, of which the barrel was tied on with a piece of string, and followed them towards the pools. When he came close enough to hear the sighing of the rushes in the outermost pool, the morning was grey over the world, so that the tall rushes, the still waters, the vague clouds, the thin mists lying among the sand heaps, seemed carved out of an enormous pearl. In a little he came upon the herons, of whom there were a great number, standing with lifted legs in the shallow water. And crouching down behind a bank of rushes, looked to the priming of his gun, and bent for a moment over his rosary to murmur, "Patron Patrick, let me shoot a heron. Made into a pie it will support me for nearly 4 days, for I no longer eat as in my youth. If you keep me from missing I will say a rosary to you every night until the pie is eaten." Then he lay down, and, resting his gun upon a large stone, turned towards a heron which stood upon a bank of smooth grass over a little stream that flowed into the pool. For he feared to take the rheumatism by wading, as he would have to do if he shot one of those which stood in the water. But when he looked along the barrel the heron was gone, and, to his wonder and terror, a man of infinitely great age and infirmity stood in its place. He lowered the gun, and the heron stood there with bent head and motionless feathers, as though it had slept from the beginning of the world. He raised the gun, and no sooner did he look along the iron than that enemy of all enchantment brought the old man again before him, only to vanish when he lowered the gun for the second time. He laid the gun down, and crossed himself 3 times, and said a Paternoster and an Ave Maria, and muttered half aloud, "Some enemy of God and of my patron is standing upon the smooth place and fishing in the blessed water." And then aimed very carefully and slowly. He fired, and when the smoke had gone saw an old man, huddled upon the grass and a long line of herons flying with clamor towards the sea. He went round a bend of the pool, and coming to the little stream looked down on a figure wrapped in faded clothes of black and green of an ancient pattern and spotted with blood. He shook his head at the sight of so great a wickedness. Suddenly the clothes moved and an arm was stretched upwards towards the rosary which hung about his neck, and long wasted fingers almost touched the cross. He started back, crying, "Wizard, I will let no wicked thing touch my blessed beads." And the sense of the old great danger just escaped made him tremble. "If you listen to me," replied a voice so faint that it was like a sigh, "you will know that I am not a wizard, and you will let me kiss the cross before I die." "I will listen to you," he answered, "but I will not let you touch my blessed beads," and sitting on the grass a little way from the dying man, he reloaded his gun and laid it across his knees and composed himself to listen. I know not how many generations ago we, who are now herons, were the men of learning of the King Leaghair. We neither hunted, nor went to battle, nor listened to the Druids' preaching, and even love, if it came to us at all, was but a passing fire. The Druids and the poets told us, many and many a time, of a new Druid Patrick. And most among them were fierce against him, while a few thought his doctrine merely the doctrine of the god set out in new symbols, and were for giving him welcome, but we yawned in the midst of their tale. At last they came crying that he was coming to the king's house, and fell to their dispute, but we would listen to neither party, for we were busy with a dispute about the merits of the great and of the little meter. Nor were we disturbed when they passed our door with sticks of enchantment under their arms, travelling towards the forest to contend against his coming, nor when they returned after nightfall with torn robes and despairing cries. For the click of our knives writing our thoughts in Ogham filled us with peace and our dispute filled us with joy, nor even when in the morning crowds passed us to hear the strange Druid preaching the commandments of his God. The crowds passed, and one, who had laid down his knife to yawn and stretch himself, heard a voice speaking far off, and knew that the Druid Patrick was preaching within the king's house. But our hearts were deaf, and we carved and disputed and read, and laughed a thin laughter together. In a little we heard many feet coming towards the house, and presently 2 tall figures stood in the door, the one in white, the other in a crimson robe, like a great lily and a heavy poppy, and we knew the Druid Patrick and our King Leaghair. We laid down the slender knives and bowed before the king, but when the black and green robes had ceased to rustle, it was not the loud rough voice of King Leaghair that spoke to us, but a strange voice in which there was a rapture as of one speaking from behind a battlement of Druid flame. "I preached the commandments of the Maker of the world," it said. Within the king's house and from the center of the earth to the windows of heaven there was a great silence, so that the eagle floated with unmoving wings in the white air, and the fish with unmoving fins in the dim water. While the linnets and the wrens and the sparrows stilled their ever-trembling tongues in the heavy boughs, and the clouds were like white marble, and the rivers became their motionless mirrors. And the shrimps in the far-off sea-pools were still enduring eternity in patience, although it was hard. And as he named these things, it was like a king numbering his people. But your slender knives went click, click, upon the oaken staves, and, all else being silent, the sound shook the angels with anger. Oh, little roots, nipped by the winter, who do not awake although the summer pass above you with innumerable feet. Oh, men who have no part in love, who have no part in song, who have no part in wisdom, but dwell with the shadows of memory where the feet of angels cannot touch you as they pass over your heads. Where the hair of demons cannot sweep about you as they pass under your feet, I lay upon you a curse, and change you to an example for ever and ever. You shall become grey herons and stand pondering in grey pools and flit over the world in that hour when it is most full of sighs, having forgotten the flame of the stars and not yet found the flame of the sun. And you shall preach to the other herons until they also are like you, and are an example for ever and ever, and your deaths shall come to you by chance and unforeseen, that no fire of certainty may visit your hearts. The voice of the old man of learning became still, but the Votin bent over his gun with his eyes upon the ground, trying in vain to understand something of this tale. And he had so bent, it may be for a long time, had not a tug at his rosary made him start out of his dream. The old man of learning had crawled along the grass, and was now trying to draw the cross down low enough for his lips to reach it. "You must not touch my blessed beads," cried the Votin, and struck the long withered fingers with the barrel of his gun. He need not have trembled, for the old man fell back upon the grass with a sigh and was still. He bent down and began to consider the black and green clothes, for his fear had begun to pass away when he came to understand that he had something the man of learning wanted and pleaded for, and now that the blessed beads were safe, his fear had nearly all gone. And surely, he thought, if that big cloak, and that little tight-fitting cloak under it, were warm and without holes, St. Patrick would take the enchantment out of them and leave them fit for human use. But the black and green clothes fell away wherever his fingers touched them, and while this was a new wonder, a slight wind blew over the pool and crumbled the old man of learning and all his ancient gear into a little heap of dust. And then made the little heap less and less until there was nothing but the smooth green grass. Where there is nothing, there is God. The little wicker houses at Tulloch, where the brothers were accustomed to pray, or bend over many handicrafts, when twilight had driven them from the fields, were empty. For the hardness of the winter had brought the brotherhood together in the little wooden house under the shadow of the wooden chapel. And Abbot Malithgenius, Brother Dove, Brother Bald Fox, Brother Peter, Brother Patrick, Brother Bittern, Brother Fairbrows, and many too young to have won names in the great battle, sat about the fire with ruddy faces. One mending lines to lay in the river for eels, one fashioning a snare for birds, one mending the broken handle of a spade, one writing in a large book, and one shaping a jeweled box to hold the book. And among the rushes at their feet lay the scholars, who would one day be brothers, and whose schoolhouse it was, and for the succor of whose tender years the great fire was supposed to leap and flicker. One of these, a child of 8 or 9 years, called Oliol, lay upon his back looking up through the hole in the roof, through which the smoke went, and watching the stars appearing and disappearing in the smoke with mild eyes, like the eyes of a beast of the field. He turned presently to the brother who wrote in the big book, and whose duty was to teach the children, and said, "Brother Dove, to what are the stars fastened?" The brother, rejoicing to see so much curiosity in the stupidest of his scholars, laid down the pen and said, "There are 9 crystalline spheres, and on the first the moon is fastened, on the second the planet Mercury, on the third the planet Venus, on the fourth the sun, on the fifth the planet Mars, on the sixth the planet Jupiter, on the seventh the planet Saturn. These are the wandering stars, and on the 8th are fastened the fixed stars, but the 9th sphere is a sphere of the substance on which the breath of God moved in the beginning." "What is beyond that?" said the child. "There is nothing beyond that, there is God." And then the child's eyes strayed to the jeweled box, where one great ruby was gleaming in the light of the fire, and he said, "Why has Brother Peter put a great ruby on the side of the box?" "The ruby is a symbol of the love of God." "Why is the ruby a symbol of the love of God?" "Because it is red, like fire, and fire burns up everything, and where there is nothing, there is God." The child sank into silence, but presently sat up and said, "There is somebody outside." "No," replied the brother. "It is only the wolves, I have heard them moving about in the snow for some time. They are growing very wild, now that the winter drives them from the mountains. They broke into a fold last night and carried off many sheep, and if we are not careful they will devour everything." No, it is the footstep of a man, for it is heavy. But I can hear the footsteps of the wolves also. He had no sooner done speaking than somebody rapped 3 times, but with no great loudness. I will go and open, for he must be very cold. Do not open, for it may be a man-wolf, and he may devour us all. But the boy had already drawn back the heavy wooden bolt, and all the faces, most of them a little pale, turned towards the slowly opening door. He has beads and a cross, he cannot be a man-wolf, said the child, as a man with the snow heavy on his long, ragged beard, and on the matted hair, that fell over his shoulders and nearly to his waist. And dropping from the tattered cloak that but half covered his withered brown body, came in and looked from face to face with mild, ecstatic eyes. Standing some way from the fire, and with eyes that had rested at last upon the abbot Malagenius, he cried out, O blessed abbot, let me come to the fire and warm myself and dry the snow from my beard and my hair and my cloak. That I may not die of the cold of the mountains, and anger the Lord with a wilful martyrdom. Come to the fire, said the abbot, and warm yourself, and eat the food the boy Oliol will bring you. It is sad indeed that any for whom Christ has died should be as poor as you. The man sat over the fire, and Oliol took away his now dripping cloak and laid meat and bread and wine before him. But he would eat only of the bread, and he put away the wine, asking for water. When his beard and hair had begun to dry a little and his limbs had ceased to shiver with the cold, he spoke again. O blessed abbot, have pity on the poor, have pity on a beggar who has trodden the bare world this many a year, and give me some labor to do, the hardest there is, for I am the poorest of God's poor. Then the brothers discussed together what work they could put him to, and at first to little purpose, for there was no labor that had not found its labor in that busy community. But at last one remembered that brother Bald Fox, whose business it was to turn the great quern in the quern house, for he was too stupid for anything else, was getting old for so heavy a labor. And so the beggar was put to the quern from the morrow. The cold passed away, and the spring grew to summer, and the quern was never idle, nor was it turned with grudging labor, for when any passed the beggar was heard singing as he drove the handle round. The last gloom, too, had passed from that happy community, for Oliol, who had always been stupid and unteachable, grew clever, and this was the more miraculous because it had come of a sudden. One day he had been even duller than usual, and was beaten and told to know his lesson better on the morrow or be sent into a lower class among little boys who would make a joke of him. He had gone out in tears, and when he came the next day, although his stupidity, born of a mind that would listen to every wandering sound and brood upon every wandering light, had so long been the byword of the school, he knew his lesson so well that he passed to the head of the class, and from that day was the best of scholars. At first Brother Dove thought this was an answer to his own prayers to the Virgin, and took it for a great proof of the love she bore him. But when many far more fervid prayers had failed to add a single wheat sheaf to the harvest, he began to think that the child was trafficking with bards, or druids, or witches, and resolved to follow and watch. He had told his thought to the abbot, who bid him come to him the moment he hit the truth. And the next day, which was a Sunday, he stood in the path when the abbot and the brothers were coming from vespers, with their white habits upon them, and took the abbot by the habit and said, The beggar is of the greatest of saints and of the workers of miracle. I followed Oliol but now, and by his slow steps and his bent head I saw that the weariness of his stupidity was over him. And when he came to the little wood by the quern house I knew by the path broken in the underwood and by the footmarks in the muddy places that he had gone that way many times. I hid behind a bush where the path doubled upon itself at a sloping place, and understood by the tears in his eyes that his stupidity was too old and his wisdom too new to save him from terror of the rod. When he was in the quern house I went to the window and looked in, and the birds came down and perched upon my head and my shoulders, for they are not timid in that holy place. And a wolf passed by, his right side shaking my habit, his left the leaves of a bush. Oliol opened his book and turned to the page I had told him to learn, and began to cry, and the beggar sat beside him and comforted him until he fell asleep. When his sleep was of the deepest the beggar knelt down and prayed aloud, and said, O thou who dwellest beyond the stars, show forth thy power as at the beginning, and let knowledge sent from thee awaken in his mind. Wherein is nothing from the world, that the 9 orders of angels may glorify thy name. And then a light broke out of the air and wrapped Aegon, and I smelt the breath of roses. I stirred a little in my wonder, and the beggar turned and saw me, and, bending low, said, O brother dove, if I have done wrong, forgive me, and I will do penance. It was my pity moved me. But I was afraid and I ran away, and did not stop running until I came here. Then all the brothers began talking together, one saying it was such and such a saint, and one that it was not he but another. And one that it was none of these, for they were still in their brotherhoods, but that it was such and such a one. And the talk was as near to quarreling as might be in that gentle community, for each would claim so great a saint for his native province. At last the abbot said, He is none that you have named, for at Easter I had greeting from all, and each was in his brotherhood. But he is Angus the lover of God, and the first of those who have gone to live in the wild places and among the wild beasts. 10 years ago he felt the burden of many labors in a brotherhood under the hill of Patrick and went into the forest that he might labor only with song to the Lord. But the fame of his holiness brought many thousands to his cell, so that a little pride clung to a soul from which all else had been driven. 9 years ago he dressed himself in rags, and from that day none has seen him, unless, indeed, it be true that he has been seen living among the wolves on the mountains and eating the grass of the fields. Let us go to him and bow down before him. For at last, after long seeking, he has found the nothing that is God, and bid him lead us in the pathway he has trodden. They passed in their white habits along the beaten path in the wood, the acolytes swinging their censers before them, and the abbot, with his crosier studded with precious stones, in the midst of the incense. And came before the corn-house and knelt down and began to pray, awaiting the moment when the child would wake, and the saint cease from his watch and come to look at the sun going down into the unknown darkness, as his way was. Of Costello the proud, of Oona the daughter of Dermott, and of the bitter tongue. Costello had come up from the fields and lay upon the ground before the door of his square tower, resting his head upon his hands and looking at the sunset. And considering the chances of the weather. Though the customs of Elizabeth and James, now going out of fashion in England, had begun to prevail among the gentry, he still wore the great cloak of the native Irish. And the sensitive outlines of his face and the greatness of his indolent body had a commingling of pride and strength which belonged to a simpler age. His eyes wandered from the sunset to where the long white road lost itself over the southwestern horizon and to a horseman who toiled slowly up the hill. A few more minutes and the horseman was near enough for his little and shapeless body, his long Irish cloak, and the dilapidated bagpipes hanging from his shoulders, and the rough-haired Garin under him, to be seen distinctly in the grey dusk. So soon as he had come within earshot, he began crying, Is it sleeping you are, Tomás Costello, when better men break their hearts on the great white roads? Get up out of that, proud Tomás, for I have news. Get up out of that, you great Omidhon. Shake yourself out of the earth, you great weed of a man. Costello had risen to his feet, and as the piper came up to him seized him by the neck of his jacket, and lifting him out of his saddle threw him on to the ground. Let me alone, said the other, but Costello still shook him. I have news from Dermott's daughter, Winnie. The great fingers were loosened, and the piper rose gasping. Why did you not tell me, said Costello, that you came from her? You might have railed your fill. I have come from her, but I will not speak unless I am paid for my shaking. Costello fumbled at the bag in which he carried his money, and it was some time before it would open, for the hand that had overcome many men shook with fear and hope. Here is all the money in my bag, he said, dropping a stream of French and Spanish money into the hand of the piper, who bit the coins before he would answer. That is right, that is a fair price, but I will not speak till I have good protection, for if the Dermotts lay their hands upon me in any bareen after sundown, or in Coulavin by day, I will be left to rot among the nettles of a ditch. Or hung on the great sycamore, where they hung the horse thieves last Belton 4 years. And while he spoke he tied the reins of his Garin to a bar of rusty iron that was mortared into the wall. I will make you my piper and my body servant, said Costello, and no man dare lay hands upon the man, or the goat, or the horse, or the dog that is Tomas Costello's. And I will only tell my message, said the other, flinging the saddle on the ground, in the corner of the chimney with a noggin in my hand, and a jug of the brew of the little pot beside me, for though I am ragged and empty, my forebears were well clothed and full until their house was burnt and their cattle harried 7 centuries ago by the Dylans, whom I shall yet see on the hob of hell, and they screeching. And while he spoke the little eyes gleamed and the thin hands clenched. Costello led him into the great rush-strewn hall, where were none of the comforts which had begun to grow common among the gentry, but a feudal gauntness and bareness, and pointed to the bench in the great chimney. And when he had sat down, filled up a horn noggin and set it on the bench beside him, and set a great black jack of leather beside the noggin, and lit a torch that slanted out from a ring in the wall, his hands trembling the while. And then turned towards him and said, Will Dermot's daughter come to me, Dualac, son of Daly? Dermot's daughter will not come to you, for her father has set women to watch her, but she bid me tell you that this day se'nnight will be the eve of St. John and the night of her betrothal to Nemera of the lake, and she would have you there that, when they bid her drink to him she loves best, as the way is, she may drink to you, Tomas Costello, and let all know where her heart is. And how little of gladness is in her marriage. And I myself bid you go with good men about you, for I saw the horse thieves with my own eyes, and they dancing the blue pigeon in the air. And then he held the now empty noggin towards Costello, his hand closing round it like the claw of a bird, and cried, Fill my noggin again, for I would the day had come when all the water in the world is to shrink into a periwinkle shell. That I might drink nothing but poteen. Finding that Costello made no reply, but sat in a dream, he burst out, Fill my noggin, I tell you, for no Costello is so great in the world that he should not wait upon a daily. Even though the daily travel the road with his pipes and the Costello have a bare hill, an empty house, a horse, a herd of goats, and a handful of cows. Praise the Dallas if you will, said Costello as he filled the noggin, for you have brought me a kind word from my love. For the next few days Dualac went hither and thither trying to raise a bodyguard, and every man he met had some story of Costello. How he killed the wrestler when but a boy by so straining at the belt that went about them both that he broke the big wrestler's back. How when somewhat older he dragged fierce horses through a ford in the Unchayan for a wager, how when he came to manhood he broke the steel horseshoe in Mayo. How he drove many men before him through rushy meadow at Drummond because of a malevolent song they had about his poverty, and of many another deed of his strength and pride. But he could find none who would trust themselves with any so passionate and poor in a quarrel with careful and wealthy persons like Dermott of the sheep and Nemera of the lake. Then Costello went out himself, and after listening to many excuses and in many places, brought in a big half-witted fellow, who followed him like a dog, a farm laborer who worshipped him for his strength. A fat farmer whose forefathers had served his family, and a couple of lads who looked after his goats and cows. And marshalled them before the fire in the empty hall. They had brought with them their stout cudgels, and Costello gave them an old pistol apiece, and kept them all night drinking Spanish ale and shooting at a white turnip which he pinned against the wall with a skewer. Dualac of the pipe sat on the bench in the chimney playing The Green Bunch of Rushes, The Unchayan Stream, and The Princes of Breffany on his old pipes, and railing now at the appearance of the shooters, now at their clumsy shooting. And now at Costello because he had no better servants. The laborer, the half-witted fellow, the farmer and the lads were all well accustomed to Dualac's railing, for it was as inseparable from wake or wedding as the squealing of his pipes, but they wondered at the forbearance of Costello, who seldom came either to wake or wedding, and if he had would scarce have been patient with a scolding piper. On the next evening they set out for Coulavin, Costello riding a tolerable horse and carrying a sword, the others upon rough-haired garrons, and with their stout cudgels under their arms. As they rode over the bogs and in the barreens among the hills they could see fire answering fire from hill to hill, from horizon to horizon, and everywhere groups who danced in the red light on the turf, celebrating the bridal of life and fire. When they came to Dermott's house they saw before the door an unusually large group of the very poor, dancing about a fire, in the midst of which was a blazing cartwheel, that circular dance which is so ancient that the gods long dwindled to be but fairies, danced no other in their secret places. From the door and through the long loopholes on either side came the pale light of candles and the sound of many feet dancing a dance of Elizabeth and James. They tied their horses to bushes, for the number so tied already showed that the stables were full, and shoved their way through a crowd of peasants who stood about the door, and went into the great hall where the dance was. The laborer, the half-witted fellow, the farmer and the two lads mixed with a group of servants who were looking on from an alcove, and Duillac sat with the pipers on their bench. But Costello made his way through the dancers to where Dermott of the sheep stood with Nemera of the lake pouring poteen out of a porcelain jug into horn noggins with silver rims. "Tomas Costello," said the old man, "you have done a good deed to forget what has been, and to fling away enmity and come to the betrothal of my daughter to Nemera of the lake." "I come," answered Costello, "because when in the time of Costello de Angelo my forebears overcame your forebears and afterwards made peace. A compact was made that a Costello might go with his body servants and his piper to every feast given by a Dermott for ever, and a Dermott with his body servants and his piper to every feast given by a Costello for ever. If you come with evil thoughts and armed men," said the son of Dermott flushing, "no matter how strong your hands to wrestle and to swing the sword, it shall go badly with you, for some of my wife's clan have come out of Mayo. And my 3 brothers and their servants have come down from the Ox Mountains." And while he spoke he kept his hand inside his coat as though upon the handle of a weapon. "No," answered Costello, "I but come to dance a farewell dance with your daughter." Dermott drew his hand out of his coat and went over to a tall pale girl who was now standing but a little way off with her mild eyes fixed upon the ground. "Costello has come to dance a farewell dance, for he knows that you will never see one another again." The girl lifted her eyes and gazed at Costello, and in her gaze was that trust of the humble in the proud, the gentle in the violent, which has been the tragedy of woman from the beginning. Costello led her among the dancers, and they were soon drawn into the rhythm of the pavane, that stately dance which, with the saraband, the gaulead, and the Morris dances, had driven out, among all but the most Irish of the gentry, the quicker rhythms of the verse interwoven, pantomimic dances of earlier days. And while they danced there came over them the unutterable melancholy, the weariness with the world, the poignant and bitter pity for one another, the vague anger against common hopes and fears, which is the exultation of love. And when a dance ended and the pipers laid down their pipes and lifted their horn noggins, they stood a little from the others waiting pensively and silently for the dance to begin again and the fire in their hearts to leap up and to wrap them anew. And so they danced pavane and saraband and gaulead and Morris through the night long, and many stood still to watch them, and the peasants came about the door and peered in, as though they understood that they would gather their children's children about them long hence, and tell how they had seen Costello dance with Dermott's daughter Oona, and become by the telling themselves a portion of ancient romance. But through all the dancing and piping Nemera of the lake went hither and thither talking loudly and making foolish jokes that all might seem well with him, and old Dermott of the sheep grew redder and redder, and looked oftener and oftener at the doorway to see if the candles there grew yellow in the dawn. At last he saw that the moment to end had come, and, in a pause after a dance, cried out from where the horn noggins stood that his daughter would now drink the cup of betrothal. Then Oona came over to where he was, and the guests stood round in a half-circle, Costello close to the wall to the right, and the piper, the labourer, the farmer, the half-witted man and the 2 farm lads close behind him. The old man took out of a niche in the wall the silver cup from which her mother and her mother's mother had drunk the toasts of their betrothals, and poured poteen out of a porcelain jug and handed the cup to his daughter with the customary words. "Drink to him whom you love the best." She held the cup to her lips for a moment, and then said in a clear soft voice, "I drink to my true love, Tomas Costello." And then the cup rolled over and over on the ground, ringing like a bell, for the old man had struck her in the face and the cup had fallen, and there was a deep silence. There were many of Nemera's people among the servants now come out of the alcove, and one of them, a storyteller and poet, a last remnant of the bardic order, who had a chair and a platter in Nemera's kitchen, drew a French knife out of his girdle and made as though he would strike at Costello, but in a moment a blow had hurled him to the ground, his shoulder sending the cup rolling and ringing again. The click of steel had followed quickly, had not there come a muttering and shouting from the peasants about the door and from those crowding up behind them. And all knew that these were no children of Queen's Irish or friendly Nimeras and Dermotts, but of the wild Irish about Loch Garra and Loch Carra, who rode their skin coracles, and had masses of hair over their eyes. And left the right arms of their children unchristened that they might give the stouter blows, and swore only by St. Attorney and sun and moon, and worshipped beauty and strength more than Saint Attorney or sun and moon. Costello's hand had rested upon the handle of his sword and his knuckles had grown white, but now he drew it away, and, followed by those who were with him, strode towards the door, the dancers giving way before him, the most angrily and slowly. And with glances at the muttering and shouting peasants, but some gladly and quickly, because the glory of his fame was over him. He passed through the fierce and friendly peasant faces, and came where his good horse and the rough-haired garrons were tied to bushes, and mounted and bade his ungainly bodyguard mount also and ride into the narrow bareen. When they had gone a little way, Dualac, who rode last, turned towards the house where a little group of Dermotts and Nimeras stood next to a more numerous group of countrymen, and cried, "Dermott, you deserve to be as you are this hour. A lantern without a candle, a purse without a penny, a sheep without wool, for your hand was ever niggardly to piper and fiddler and storyteller and to poor travelling people." He had not done before the 3 old Dermotts from the Ox Mountains had run towards their horses, and old Dermott himself had caught the bridle of a Garron of the Nimeras and was calling to the others to follow him. And many blows and many deaths had not the countrymen caught up still glowing sticks from the ashes of the fires and hurled them among the horses with loud cries, making all plunge and rear, and some break from those who held them, the whites of their eyes gleaming in the dawn. For the next few weeks Costello had no lack of news of Oona, for now a woman selling eggs or fowls, and now a man or a woman on pilgrimage to the Well of the Rocks, would tell him how his love had fallen ill the day after St. John's Eve, and how she was a little better or a little worse, as it might be. And though he looked to his horses and his cows and goats as usual, the common and uncomely, the dust upon the roads, the songs of men returning from fairs and wakes, men playing cards in the corners of fields on Sundays and saints' days. The rumors of battles and changes in the great world, the deliberate purposes of those about him, troubled him with an inexplicable trouble. And the country people still remember how when night had fallen he would bid Dualac of the pipes tell, to the chirping of the crickets, the son of Apple, the beauty of the world, the king of Ireland's son. Or some other of those traditional tales which were as much a piper's business as the green bunch of rushes, the Unchayan stream, or the chiefs of Breffni. And while the boundless and phantasmal world of the legends was building, would abandon himself to the dreams of his sorrow. Dualac would often pause to tell how some clan of the wild Irish had descended from an incomparable king of the Blue Belt, or warrior of the Osier Wattle. Or to tell with many curses how all the strangers and most of the Queen's Irish were the seed of the misshapen and horned people from under the sea or of the serval and creeping firbolg. But Costello cared only for the love sorrows, and no matter whither the stories wandered, whether to the Isle of the Red Loch, where the blessed are, or to the malign country of the Hag of the East, Oona alone endured their shadowy hardships. For it was she and no king's daughter of old who was hidden in the steel tower under the water with the folds of the worm of 9 eyes round and about her prison. And it was she who won by 7 years of service the right to deliver from hell all she could carry, and carried away multitudes clinging with worn fingers to the hem of her dress. And it was she who endured dumbness for a year because of the little thorn of enchantment the fairies had thrust into her tongue. And it was a lock of her hair, coiled in a little carved box, which gave so great a light that men threshed by it from sundown to sunrise. And awoke so great a wonder that kings spent years in wandering or fell before unknown armies in seeking to discover her hiding place. For there was no beauty in the world but hers, no tragedy in the world but hers, and when at last the voice of the piper, grown gentle with the wisdom of old romance, was silent, and his rheumatic steps had toiled upstairs and to bed, and Costello had dipped his fingers into the little delf font of holy water and begun to pray to Mary of the 7 Sorrows, the blue eyes and star-covered dress of the painting in the chapel faded from his imagination. And the brown eyes and homespun dress of Dermott's daughter Winnie came in their stead. For there was no tenderness in the passion who keep their hearts pure for love or for hatred as other men for God, for Mary and for the saints, and who, when the hour of their visitation arrives, come to the divine essence by the bitter tumult. The Garden of Gethsemane, and the desolate route ordained for immortal passions in mortal hearts. One day a serving man rode up to Costello, who was helping his 2 lads to reap a meadow, and gave him a letter, and rode away without a word, and the letter contained these words in English: "Tomas Costello, my daughter is very ill. The wise woman from Knocknassidhe has seen her, and says she will die unless you come to her. I therefore bid you come to her whose peace you stole by treachery, Dermott, the son of Dermott." Costello threw down his scythe, and sent one of the lads for Duilac, who had become woven into his mind with Oona, and himself saddled his great horse and Duilac as Garin. When they came to Dermott's house it was late afternoon, and Loch Garra lay down below them, blue, mirror-like, and deserted. And though they had seen, when at a distance, dark figures moving about the door, the house appeared not less deserted than the loch. The door stood half open, and Costello knocked upon it again and again, so that a number of lake gulls flew up out of the grass and circled screaming over his head, but there was no answer. "There is no one here," said Duilac, "for Dermott of the Sheep is too proud to welcome Costello the Proud," and he threw the door open, and they saw a ragged, dirty, very old woman, who sat upon the floor leaning against the wall. Costello knew that it was Bridget Delaney, a deaf and dumb beggar, and she, when she saw him, stood up and made a sign to him to follow, and led him and his companion up a stair and down a long corridor to a closed door. She pushed the door open and went a little way off and sat down as before. Duilac sat upon the ground also, but close to the door, and Costello went and gazed upon Winnie sleeping upon a bed. He sat upon a chair beside her and waited, and a long time passed and still she slept on, and then Duilac motioned to him through the door to wake her, but he hushed his very breath, that she might sleep on. For his heart was full of that ungovernable pity which makes the fading heart of the lover a shadow of the divine heart. Presently he turned to Duilac and said, "It is not right that I stay here where there are none of her kindred, for the common people are always ready to blame the beautiful." And then they went down and stood at the door of the house and waited, but the evening wore on and no one came. "It was a foolish man that called you proud, Costello," Duilac cried at last. "Had he seen you waiting and waiting where they left none but a beggar to welcome you, it is humble Costello he would have called you." Then Costello mounted and Duilac mounted, but when they had ridden a little way Costello tightened the reins and made his horse stand still. Many minutes passed, and then Duilac cried, "It is no wonder that you fear to offend Dermott of the Sheep, for he has many brothers and friends, and though he is old, he is a strong man and ready with his hands, and he is of the Queen's Irish. And the enemies of the Gael are upon his side." And Costello answered flushing and looking towards the house, "I swear by the Mother of God that I will never return there again if they do not send after me before I pass the ford in the Brown River," and he rode on. But so very slowly that the sun went down and the bats began to fly over the bogs. When he came to the river he lingered a while upon the bank among the flowers of the flag, but presently rode out into the middle and stopped his horse in a foaming shallow. Duilac, however, crossed over and waited on a further bank above a deeper place. After a good while Duilac cried out again, and this time very bitterly, "It was a fool who begot you and a fool who bore you, and they are fools of all fools who say you come of an old and noble stock. For you come of way-faced beggars who travelled from door to door, bowing to gentles and to serving men." With bent head, Costello rode through the river and stood beside him, and would have spoken had not hoofs clattered on the further bank and a horseman splashed towards them. It was a serving man of Dermott's, and he said, speaking breathlessly like one who had ridden hard, "Tomas Costello, I come to bid you again to Dermott's house." When you had gone, his daughter Winnie awoke and called your name, for you had been in her dreams. Bridget Delaney the dummy saw her lips move and the trouble upon her, and came where we were hiding in the wood above the house and took Dermott of the Sheep by the coat and brought him to his daughter. He saw the trouble upon her, and bid me ride his own horse to bring you the quicker. Then Costello turned towards the piper Duilac daily, and taking him about the waist lifted him out of the saddle and hurled him against a grey rock that rose up out of the river, so that he fell lifeless into the deep place. And the waters swept over the tongue which God had made bitter, that there might be a story in men's ears in after time. Then plunging his spurs into the horse, he rode away furiously toward the northwest, along the edge of the river, and did not pause until he came to another and smoother ford, and saw the rising moon mirrored in the water. He paused for a moment irresolute, and then rode into the ford and on over the Ox Mountains, and down towards the sea. His eyes almost continually resting upon the moon which glimmered in the dimness like a great white rose hung on the lattice of some boundless and phantasmal world. But now his horse, long dark with sweat and breathing hard, for he kept spurring it to an extreme speed, fell heavily, hurling him into the grass at the roadside. He tried to make it stand up, and failing in this, went on alone towards the moonlight, and came to the sea and saw a schooner lying there at anchor. Now that he could go no further because of the sea, he found that he was very tired and the night very cold, and went into a shebeen close to the shore and threw himself down upon a bench. The room was full of Spanish and Irish sailors who had just smuggled a cargo of wine and ale, and were waiting a favourable wind to set out again. A Spaniard offered him a drink in bad Gaelic. He drank it greedily and began talking wildly and rapidly. For some 3 weeks the wind blew inshore or with too great violence, and the sailors stayed drinking and talking and playing cards, and Costello stayed with them, sleeping upon a bench in the shebeen. And drinking and talking and playing more than any. He soon lost what little money he had, and then his horse, which some one had brought from the mountain Barine, to a Spaniard, who sold it to a farmer from the mountains, and then his long cloak and his spurs and his boots of soft leather. At last a gentle wind blew towards Spain, and the crew rowed out to their schooner, singing Gaelic and Spanish songs, and lifted the anchor, and in a little while the white sails had dropped under the horizon. Then Costello turned homeward, his life gaping before him, and walked all day, coming in the early evening to the road that went from near Loch Garra to the southern edge of Loch Kay. Here he overtook a great crowd of peasants and farmers, who were walking very slowly after 2 priests and a group of well-dressed persons, certain of whom were carrying a coffin. He stopped an old man and asked whose burying it was and whose people they were, and the old man answered, "It is the burying of Oona, Dermott's daughter, and we are the Nameras and the Dermotts and their following. And you are Tomás Costello who murdered her." Costello went on towards the head of the procession, passing men who looked at him with fierce eyes and only vaguely understanding what he had heard, for now that he had lost the understanding that belongs to good health. It seemed impossible that a gentleness and a beauty which had been so long the world's heart could pass away. Presently he stopped and asked again whose burying it was, and a man answered, "We are carrying Dermott's daughter Winnie whom you murdered, to be buried in the island of the Holy Trinity." And the man stooped and picked up a stone and cast it at Costello, striking him on the cheek and making the blood flow out over his face. Costello went on scarcely feeling the blow, and coming to those about the coffin, shouldered his way into the midst of them, and laying his hand upon the coffin, asked in a loud voice, "Who is in this coffin?" The 3 old Dermotts from the Ox Mountains caught up stones and bid those about them do the same, and he was driven from the road, covered with wounds, and but for the priests would surely have been killed. When the procession had passed on, Costello began to follow again, and saw from a distance the coffin laid upon a large boat, and those about it get into other boats, and the boats move slowly over the water to Insula Trinitatis. And after a time he saw the boats return and their passengers mingle with the crowd upon the bank, and all disperse by many roads and barines. It seemed to him that Winnie was somewhere on the island smiling gently as of old, and when all had gone he swam in the way the boats had been rowed and found the new-made grave beside the ruined abbey of the Holy Trinity, and threw himself upon it, calling to Oona to come to him. Above him the square ivy leaves trembled, and all about him white moths moved over white flowers, and sweet odors drifted through the dim air. He lay there all that night and through the day after, from time to time calling her to come to him, but when the 3rd night came he had forgotten, worn out with hunger and sorrow, that her body lay in the earth beneath. But only knew she was somewhere near and would not come to him. Just before dawn, the hour when the peasants hear his ghostly voice crying out, his pride awoke and he called loudly, "Winnie, daughter of Dermott of the Sheep, if you do not come to me I will go and never return to the island of the Holy Trinity." And before his voice had died away a cold and whirling wind had swept over the island and he saw many figures rushing past, women of the city with crowns of silver and dim floating drapery. And then Oona, but no longer smiling gently, for she passed him swiftly and angrily, and as she passed struck him upon the face crying, "Then go and never return." He would have followed, and was calling out her name, when the whole glimmering company rose up into the air, and, rushing together in the shape of a great silvery rose, faded into the ashen dawn. Costello got up from the grave, understanding nothing but that he had made his beloved angry and that she wished him to go, and wading out into the lake, began to swim. He swam on, but his limbs were too weary to keep him afloat, and her anger was heavy about him, and when he had gone a little way he sank without a struggle, like a man passing into sleep and dreams. The next day a poor fisherman found him among the reeds upon the lake shore, lying upon the white lake sand with his arms flung out as though he lay upon a rood, and carried him to his own house. And the very poor lamented over him and sang the keen, and when the time had come, laid him in the abbey on Insula Trinitatis with only the ruined altar between him and Dermott's daughter. And planted above them 2 ash trees that in after days wove their branches together and mingled their trembling leaves.